No one is smashing in Japan, okay? People need to start smashing, and it's top priority for the government. The government of Tokyo has just announced that they're going to be launching a 4-day work week to boost fertility and family time, joining a list of over 20 countries who've trialed some form of 4-day work week. The results of these trials have been described as boringly consistent. 4-day work week trials tend to result in increased productivity, the ability to attract and retain staff, and actually fewer sick days, which is kind of crazy. But Japan is actually like a slightly different country, and they have a bit more of an intense situation there. So I think it's actually worth covering what's going on. The reaction has been at best like cautiously optimistic, and at worst just super pessimistic. And there are some good reasons why. We've talked about birth rates before on the channel, and the situation is pretty dire if you aren't aware. Their population has been declining for 16 years straight, and they currently have around 1.26 births per woman, which is way below the 2.1 that you need to maintain a stable population, and is in fact one of the worst in the entire world. So I think this visual is the best way to highlight quite how bad the situation is in Japan. It plots deaths against births, and you can just see the divergence between the two. We're at a stage where almost 2 people die for every person that's born in Japan. As birth rates shrink, you still have the elderly, and those elderly still need pensions, they still need social care, they still need healthcare, and they need people to provide all of these services for them. And without the tax revenue from younger workers, without the labour supply of younger workers, you have this whole generation of people who can't be supported in the way that they need to, right? And so you can expect poverty amongst the elderly to rise, you can expect economic activity to slow down, and that's a pretty big issue, even in the short term. Will a 4-day work week actually solve it? Let's find out. It's not like 4-day work weeks haven't been tried, because just a couple of years back, Panasonic also gave the option to their 63,000 employees in Japan. But of those 63,000 employees, a whopping 150 chose to take it up. That works out at about 0.23% of their company. 99.8% of their staff chose to stick with the 5-day work week, because clearly they just enjoyed it and loved it so much. It wasn't necessarily that they don't want to work less, but they feel like they shouldn't or couldn't work less, even if the option was presented to them. The expectation and the literal pressure that's placed upon them is so intense that it can even override their desire for better working conditions. And I think it becomes a lot more clear when you develop a little bit of an understanding of Japanese work culture. This is an image of a Japanese salaryman passed out on the train, and is one of many images you can find of Japanese office workers just passed out across the city. Japanese work culture is very different to the work culture that you might be used to if you're not from East Asia. It's really heavily based in appearances rather than outcomes, whether it's, overly formal ways of giving people business cards, or more toxic parts of their work culture, such as the frequent expectation that young workers should go out drinking with their bosses on demand, a practice that is actually so common that it has a name in Japanese, nomikai. Loyalty is really important, and adhering to expectations is arguably even more important than adhering to the law. And this desire to live up to the expectation of tradition is so all-encompassing that it even, sadly, leads to deaths, to the point where the Japanese also have a word for death from overwork, karoshi. It encompasses people who die of heart attacks or strokes from having spent too much time at work. Or sadly, in some cases, people who take their own lives because of the intense pressures and the intense physical and mental toll that Japanese work culture takes. It's actually common enough in Japan that the government collects statistics on it every year, and they publish the white paper on measures to prevent karoshi, where they actually try to better understand why Japanese people are overworked to the point where they literally drop down dead. This white paper is pretty crazy. And it also helps us understand why things have not gotten better in 16 years of straight population decline, right? Because this policy is not the first thing they've tried. In 2018, they tried to alleviate this problem by publishing a set of labour reforms in the wake of the death of a 24-year-old who took her own life after working hundreds of hours of overtime every month, and ended up ushering some reforms to place limits on how much overtime people could do, and to actually require employers to do something about people dying from overwork. The employer that hired this young girl ended up implementing a change where they would turn off all the lights in the office at 10 p.m. in order to force people out, basically. And you think, okay, that's actually going to force them out. But what people did was they just got desk lamps instead. And after 10 p.m., they would just work by the light of desk lamp until their boss had left or until their boss had told them to leave. And naturally, they didn't reduce the workload. So, the amount of work that was expected to be done didn't change. I read this article from the Pulitzer Center, which was like a deep dive into death from overwork in Japan. They talked to this guy, Kasagi. He's an employment lawyer. And he says that throughout his 10-year career as a lawyer, as an employment lawyer, Kasagi has dealt with 0 cases in which labor unions protested the unfair treatment of workers. The idea of conformity and of loyalty and respect is like so far gone that even the labor unions, who are supposed to exist as like a balance, like don't even do anything, right? Part of it is because the workers themselves would be unlikely to raise it, but also the union doesn't seem to want that smoke either. To give Japan their props, I went through this white paper, this annual document that they publish on workplace deaths, and things seem to be getting better. The number of people in Japan who work more than 60 hours a week halved over the last couple of decades. The thing that makes this number a bit less relieving is when you realize how common illegal overtime is in Japan now. Because as we said, tradition often trumps the law in Japanese workplaces. The government over there carried out like studies of companies that they think perform illegal overtime. And they found that 44% of the something like 26,000 companies that they investigated had employees working illegal overtime. And that might not necessarily be captured in these statistics. One of the main issues with Japan and why this work culture still exists is that for a lot of their history, it actually kind of worked. In the 70s and 80s, Japan was a powerhouse. It was, the second biggest economy in the world, right? If you're like a Japanese boomer, you remember those days where your really strict work culture actually delivered. And depending on what your memory's like, people will tend to have false memories. You might think that if you just went back to the days of the 70s and you kept the practices of the 70s more strictly, you'd be back to economic boom. They remember the good old days and they're like, we just need to do the same shit that we did back then. After a certain amount of time, there's going to be enough Japanese people who've only known Japan in the downward spiral. And so they're not going to be as willing to stick with the system. I don't want to complain when a government is actually taking action, because even if the action isn't necessarily as effective as it should be, it's worth noting that it can get a lot worse. And the way to realize that it can get worse is to look across the Sea of Japan at Japan's mortal rivals for many centuries now. And that is South Korea, just across the water. Because they're one of the few countries that actually has a worse birth rate than Japan, and their response has been even less effective. In Korea, the 5-day work week is only like a generation old, so it was first introduced into the law in 2004, which is only 20 years ago. It was introduced as a 68-hour work week and then reduced in 2018 to 52 hours. The president of South Korea, just last year, he suggested increasing the work week up to 69 hours in order to jumpstart the economy. This is in the country that has one of the worst birth rates in the world, right? So yeah, you can't be too mad at Japan for trying something, because over in South Korea, their strategy and their approach has been even less effective. More and more South Korean firms are telling executives to work more and to actually come into the office into the weekends in response to a slowdown in economic growth for these companies. The idea is that if executives can come into the office on weekends, then junior staff will feel pressured to join them too, which is already pretty rough. When you look at the Tokyo government program, the 4-day workweek being optional is a real big barrier. You probably would expect similarly low uptake as other optional 4-day workweek programs. It's also a program that offers condensed hours rather than reduced hours, by which I mean the employees are still expected to work their standard number of hours per week, just across 4 days instead of 5. This is opposed to the 4-day work week that most actually seem to be pushing for, which is one where you work 32 hours, for example, instead of 40 hours, but you keep 100% of the pay and you're expected to do 100% of the productivity. Even the most optimistic on this appear to think that it'll just result in people working either from home on their day off or just working as much as they were before. Hence why they don't want to smash. What's written in labour laws does not always reflect the actual experience of employees, and it shows the limited impact that legal changes can have. In order for them to have impact, they need to be strict enough to actually overcome the pressures of adhering to tradition and expectation. And so for a 4-day workweek to be a success, I think we would have to see it be legally enforced and legally required, at least for a certain time period. The change, I think, in Japan is going to happen when there are enough young people who've only experienced their country being in relative decline for their entire lives and have had very little success within the current system. And so I really feel like this is one of those things that has to get worse before it gets better, you know?